From Manifold Unity, the Ancient World's Perception of the Divine Pattern of Harmony and Compassion, by Christina Vera Collum, originally published in 1940, based on material she derived and developed during her life from growing up in India in the 1890s as a leftover aristocrat from what was left of the British Raj. Moving back to England, repatriated, she became very active in the women's suffrage movement there through the 19-teens. When World War I came around, she enlisted as a field nurse in a hospital on the Western Front in France. After the war, she became involved with medical research using X-rays and radioactivity, and she actually sustained quite a strong dose, so had to stop doing that. So then she continued traveling the world and writing holistically about linking Eastern and Western philosophy, and ties it back to ancient Gnostic Christianity and many other things. So fascinating author, and this is an amazing book I want to share with you. I don't know who's going to sit and listen to 3 or 4 hours of reading this, but I encourage you to go find and read this book yourself, Manifold Unity. Chapter 1, The Prelude. Compassion is not the characteristic that most Western people would attribute to ancient Eastern religion. The most striking feature of Eastern religion in general is its expression of a sense of underlying unity, comprehending within itself the creative principle manifested in the harmony of the many in the one. This appears to most Western inquirers to be an intellectual rather than an emotional reaction to human experience. It is true that ancient Eastern civilization has always rated the serenity of the intellect in God, manifest in the universe and in man, much higher than the turbulence of emotion that to many is inseparable from the idea of love. It is a serenity that so far has not been attained by the civilization of those peoples who, not so many centuries past, were known as the barbarians of the north, a grouping, it might be salutary to recall, which includes both our own Nordic ancestors and those of the Germanic world, those Hyperboreans who, in the centuries round about the beginning of the Christian era, were by the Greeks identified with the Celtic-speaking nations. They were held, and I think rightly, to have preserved something of the older Eastern natural philosophy, music, and religion. But whatever their cultured poets and teachers may have professed, the conduct of the Celtic-speaking peoples was sometimes quite as barbarous as that of the insurgent Germanic tribes. Indeed, their most noticeable political characteristic was the egoism that made it impossible for their nations to combine faithfully in the common cause of that freedom which, for themselves, they yet rated above every other human possession. They loved liberty, but political cooperation for the common good between groups, whether republican or monarchical in social organization, seemed to be beyond their powers. In intolerant pride, a national selfishness, suspicion that bred treachery, defeated all attempts to harmonize their aims. Had this been otherwise, then Vercingetorix might have won his struggle for the liberty of the Celtic-speaking world against Rome, and the history of Europe would have been quite different, especially the history of the Christian Church. As it was, the hard and unimaginative efficiency of Rome and the ruthless and bloody cruelties of Germanic pirates branded European civilization during those ages when the civilizing influence of the East, exercised from its last outposts in Alexandria and Byzantium, was slowly being submerged by the tide of political and religious regimentation. As always, regimentation in the intellectual and spiritual sphere, no less than in the political or social, halted the progress of civilization and bred intolerance in high places and lack of enterprise in the masses. Organic life is not in it. Nothing grows there but the spores of parasitic, destructive molds that proliferate in the darkness of an unventilated soil. It is often stated as axiomatic that what saved civilization was the then renewed contact with the Near East, and with it classical literature made during the Crusades by Western Europeans, the result being seen in that the intellectual and artistic floraison known as the Renaissance. But was this true? The future course of history is quite likely to falsify the assumption. We know today more than once we did about the value of so-called classical culture, that of Greco-Roman culture, relatively to the more adult thought and art of the East. And for the purposes of this comparison, I include Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, and the Caspian Basin in the East, and would place Crete as a bridge straddling the chasm between the ancient East and the Near West, whose standard-bearer, for the purposes of drawing the picture sharply, we may say was Dorian Greece. We know more today about the incredibly futile bickerings and hair-splittings of the early leaders of the Christian Church, and of the semi-political jobbery that branded such liberal thinkers as the British Pelagius and John the Scot, who was Irish, with the name of heretics, while crowning the dark head of a perfervid Romano-African dictator such as Augustine with the official halo of sanctity. If historical research is not altogether submerged in the coming decade, and we shall know more about the worldwide spiritual reawakening that took place during the course of the intellectual movement for synthesis in religious belief that we call Gnosticism. We know that this, far from being a Christian heresy, was a pre-Christian movement, on whose surging tide primitive Christianity was borne both eastward and westward to undergo its most complete sea change upon reaching Rome. It is curious how long the local molds of men's thinking retain their shape. Authoritarianism was a plant that grew up in Rome, nourishing its roots in the grave of an Etruscan colony. The Roman Church grew true to the stock, and the fascist empire had been deliberately grafted onto it. Primitive, as distinct from authoritarian, Christianity was essentially an Eastern spiritual movement that attempted to gather up in itself and simplify a synthesis of the religious cosmic philosophy of the East. It sought to voice anew the oft-recurring protest of the wiser minds of the East against a misreading of unity as an egoistic and exclusive possessiveness towards gods by the aristocrats of religion. Its effective protest was the insistence on divine compassion toward the humblest of men. Primitive Christianity was a warning that, until men recognized their own unity as brothers and sons of one Father, they could never attain unity with God. And thanks to the printing press, the message of Jesus of Nazareth himself, as distinct from the official shibboleths of the regimented churches, is within easy reach of all. That which will be attempted here is to recall what is less easy of access. This is the oft-recorded verdict of the wise men of the ancient East, that divine unity, since it is based on sublime harmonia, to which the universe bears witness, is also an expression of divine compassion. Poets and seers have testified to this over and over again, both before and since the ministry of that Palestinian Jew, who proved his claim to divine sonship by demonstrating his right to call himself the Son of Man. Such an attempt is overdue, for never was it more necessary than it is today to reassure ourselves with the testimony of as great a cloud of witness as possible that the message of divine compassion that was brought to mankind 1940-odd years ago is implicit in creation. That if mankind would have it so, kindness and love would prevail over the selfishness and cruelty that we ourselves have loosed upon ourselves in loosing them upon our fellow creatures. Perhaps what is to most modern Europeans, and even to Orientals who have been nurtured in the materialistic and mechanistic philosophy of the past century, an angle of view that is quite fresh just because it is so very old, that it has gradually slipped from human memory, may help in the recovery of a vision of eternal truth that has been veiled by the gathering mists of doubt and misunderstanding this many a long day past. Ye ask, who are those that draw us into the kingdom, if the kingdom is in heaven? The fowls of the air, and all the beasts that are under the earth or upon the earth, and the fishes of the sea, these are they which draw you, and the kingdom of heaven is within you. And whoever shall know himself shall find it. Strive, therefore, to know yourselves, and ye shall be aware that ye are the sons of the Almighty Father, and ye shall know that ye are in the city of God, and ye are the city. Let not him who seeks cease until he finds, and when he finds he shall be astonished. Being astonished he shall reach the kingdom, and having reached the kingdom he shall rest. Wherever there are two, they are not without God, and wherever there is one alone, I say, I am with him. Raise the stone, and there thou shalt find me. Cleave the wood, and there I am. Thou hearest with one ear, but the other thou hast closed.